Well, Franklin, I want to talk a little with you about the question of racism in politics. And I talked to you as a black minister of the gospel, but also a man prominent in our community and one who has stood up publicly for your own values and not been afraid to be prophetic in your approach to the racial question here in our city of Toledo. So a man who has been in the public eye and on the television set on occasion, and one who I respect greatly for that kind of courageous stand. So I want to talk a little bit about racism in politics, and as we do so, I suppose we start out with this notion of racism. I'm seeing the racism that goes on these days a lot in more subtle fashions, and what I'm often calling a new racism. So we had our civil rights legislation. We had our Voting Rights Acts back in the 60s. We got rid of some of the blatant kind of things. It seems as though the government came in and the federal government took a leading hand in overcoming some of the blatant racism. But it would appear as though some of that still continues to go on, and maybe we can talk about that those other kinds of racisms that we find and trying to gear it into this whole political understanding. I don't know if I've said that clear enough, but maybe you want to respond to that.
I think the role of the federal government in addressing racism seems to have been most prominently visualized in the change in the South. The most leading notion right now is that in the South, institutions have been broken down to a certain extent, that blacks can do very well there in many instances, of course not all instances, that there are some things that really have changed for the better. I'm real interested right now in watching what's going on in Selma, Alabama.
Yes. Why don't you say something about that?
The whole notion that the federal government had to come in and force some changes to come about, to open up some doors for blacks to enter. And now, some 25 years later, to see those same persons who have redeveloped a new way of looking at themselves, both black and white, who feel that they have joined hands. And I think there's admission on both sides. They haven't reached a climax, but they've joined hands to bring about change. And they felt good about that. And now to see those images, those self-images being challenged, to me is kind of interesting. And there still is no, they don't want people from the outside to come in, but there's a lot of defensiveness being expressed. There's a lot of insecurity, I think, that's coming up. The thing about government forcing changes is that government cannot change a person's heart or attitude. It might make you accept people. Sooner or later, there's other challenges that have to be faced,
and that's what's happening now. Yeah. I flash on the difference that Martin Luther King found between the South and the North on this. I mean, in the South, there were, you couldn't sit at the lunch counter, and that had to be challenged, and they wouldn't allow people to register to vote, or they had all these blatant ways of keeping them from voting, and so that had to be challenged. But when he came to Chicago, he found very different things. He found almost a deeper hatred in a way than he found in the South, and he found more subtle ways in which the racism was expressed, and really had difficult dealing with that. I mean, most of the time it's thought that Martin Luther King really had failed in Chicago to make the kind of difference that he wanted to make. And so I'm seeing that as a model of maybe what happens today, where there's different attitudes that are at work and begin to influence our political structures. Franklin, there was an interesting study of efforts in Chicago.
Could I make just one more
yes,
comment
please
on that? I'm sorry. A real vivid difference in my mind between the South and the North. In the South there was a blatant, as you say, an obvious understanding that you are not welcome. They would say to you, you cannot sit at this counter. I remember as 5 years old, back in 1953, my grandmother took me down to Bluefield, West Virginia, and we went to the lunch counter to eat, and she just sat there for a while, and finally the lady came over and told her that I could eat there because I was young, but they don't serve blacks here. I mean, there was a real obvious but yet very clear message being made. In the North, though, you could sit at a lunch counter, and the waitress would simply ignore you. You could sit there all day long. She would make faces at you. They'd sneer at you, but when it just as if you didn't exist at all.
Yes.
And that creates, I think, a greater frustration within a person than the frustration that comes about when you're told no, and you fight for them to say yes, or we're going to do it because it's our right, when they just ignore you as if you don't exist at all. Like being at
to be a non-person
Yeah.
is extremely...
And that's the root, the bed of the racism, I think, that exists in the northern part of
You
our
didn't
country.
happen to see that movie Driving Miss Daisy, did you? It's an
Not
interplay
yet.
between a black chauffeur and a older Jewish woman.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. But one of the scenes is so striking. They get stopped. They're driving in the South, and they park their car for a while, and the police officers come up, and you can just feel the kind of fear that would be involved in that. I mean, just watching, you don't know what the police are going to do. And it reminded me of, nothing really happened except the tremendous racist outlooks of the black police, of the white policeman in that case, come forth, both towards the Jewish woman and the black man. It's a striking scene, but what I got out of it was this sense of fear. And I was remembering when Ted Koppel had black TV journalists, obviously high-paid, successful black people, and they were talking about this racism thing, and a couple of them made the comment, you don't know what it's like to be stopped by a policeman in the South as a black person while you're driving your car. And they said if you want to get a feel for what it's like, you'd have to have that kind of experience. Which again brings us back into the political, the structure, the very structures of our society and the way it all works here politically. We're not doing all that well. Excuse me. Not doing all that well in terms of blacks in political office. We had a talk on the campus of Toledo in the university, and the guy was talking about we have one black governor now. That's Douglas Wilder, and we have no black senators, and we have 6% of the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be representing the grassroots. 6% are black, where blacks are 12% of the population, so obviously underrepresented there. So at the certain political levels, we haven't done too well. But then you think of all the black mayors. Who would have thought back in the 60s we'd have this many black mayors of major cities in the United States? So it seems at certain levels there has been progress. What would we say, a mixed bag on this? How do you see it?
It's kind of hard for me to really differentiate in. On one hand, you could say it's a mixed bag of racial progress. On the other hand, you can talk in terms of economics. Economics has a role to play in this. Loyalty to party has a role to play in this also. It costs less to be elected mayor than it does to be elected governor. Within a state, for instance, a friend of mine, I used to rant and rave about Atlanta, Georgia, and how much progress Georgia had made. And a friend of mine said to me, yes, but once you leave Atlanta, you're back in Georgia, And within a state, there are pockets of places where you don't have minorities and you don't have black people living. And those pockets of places, I think in every state, still hold on to a lot of, and maybe even out of naivete, but they still hold on to a lot of racial biases, a lot of racial practices. Could a black person really ever lead the state of Ohio to the prominence that our state, warrants?
Well, let's look at Douglas Wilder and Virginia. They keep talking about the Virginia model here. Is there how he ended up getting elected and so on? I find it interesting, but he received 41% of the white vote in his state. That's pretty good. Of course, he got 96% of the black vote, and that's why he was able to win. But he couldn't win without the 41% of the white vote. Now, how did he do that? He worked his way up within the system. He won the respect of many people. It is quite a marvelous accomplishment, it seems to me. And he talks about the compromise and the willing to work through the system and so on that has made this possible. I noticed they were asking him a question about Andy Young was going to run for governor of Georgia. saying, is there some model here that he could be following? He says, well, he has to do it his own way in his own state. But I do find that fascinating.
He worked through the system, and there is a difference between being an activist and being a politician. Douglas Wilder is a politician. That's not to say he's not concerned about forcing, racial issues, but to me it is to say that he's taken a lot of lumps in terms of compromise. He's had to do that to be loyal to his party and to reach the prominence. He didn't come on the scene yesterday. He didn't come on the scene by raising a lot of hoopla and drawing attention to injustices. He came on the scene by working through the system, working through the political system, working through the structures, by, I'm sure, pointing out injustices as he went along, yes, without sticking his neck out too far. The other thing, and I don't have the answer to your question, but one thing I do know about Virginia is that they have a statewide coalition of black and white clergy who meet on a regular basis and who attempt to work together over some issues. I know we're probably not ready to jump into the role of the church or the gospel at this point, but there is a strong sense of religious presence there. Now, to me, that implies some things. It implies that there is a group who is raising the flags about racial injustices, about inequities in the system, in the structure, the governmental structure that's in place, that has been consistent, that is not afraid to speak out. I don't think we have that here in our state.
Yeah, and it's interesting, of course, the role of the black church in all of this. It's always been remarkable to me, the power that black ministers have within the black community. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was at another university and we had a racial problem on the campus, and we were trying to mediate it, and we were all white ministers and working to mediate between the administration and the black students who were upset, and weren't getting very far, I don't think. And then the black ministers came into the picture. They had to come from outside but they were welcomed, and I noticed that they had sort of an immediate respect on the part of the black students. They listened to them, and they really were able to help make progress. Well, I mean, I think there is a tradition, in other words, of the involvement of black churches in the political world that we don't have in other churches. I mean, it's a very tricky business. I don't know how to sort all of that out, but I do know when Jesse Jackson goes around the country and campaigns, he comes into a black church to campaign. He's at home there. Mm-hmm. They understand his language, and he knows how to speak to them. And nobody, at least as far as I know, seems to challenge that too much. I mean, it's sort of a known fact that that's a political home for him, or a place where he can address the political issues of our time within that black congregation. So there might be something different there, than we have in the white churches. I don't know quite what to make of that, but it does seem different to me.
In our city, in Toledo, we've joined hands, black and white churches together, and even have broadened that, to the Jewish community and to the Arab community through the interdenominational racial coalition. And even in our city this past week, have been able to at least put together a covenant of ideals that we can work together on in trying to bridge some of these gaps that exist between black and white community.
That covenant is very important. It's called a covenant of commitment and cooperation to justice and racial, religious, and ethnic harmony. So it's a very broad-based thing. They have a marvelous quote as a preamble from Dr. Martin Luther King, where he says that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. I think Martin Luther King had a marvelous sense of the interdependence of the human community, that we have one family, and he knew how to say it in striking ways. And I suppose we go back to our Christian roots, we're saying, well, we're made in God's image. All people are made in God's image, not just white folk. All of us are sons and daughters of the great God, all in one family, all redeemed by the cross of Jesus Christ, all gathered gathered together in the power of the one Spirit. And I believe that, there's that fundamental theological understanding that we carry in the churches, which could help us.
Yeah.
And then it begins to lead to things, as the covenant says, we're going to have to do better. We envision a day in our own community where the justice, equity, and equality will become reality for all of our citizens. Mm-hmm. Equal access to quality education and employment. And then trying to commit ourselves to doing some things. Speak out to promote justice, it says. Work aggressively to get this harmony. We need better quality city services for everybody. So we got a whole lot of things like that, it seems to me, that make a lot of sense here. But and a lot of the religious community is behind this, right? And promoting this kind of harmony.
The ethics of the church are sometimes vastly different from the ethics of politics. And yet we have the opportunity, you use the word aggressively, we have the opportunity to bring our values into the structures of our society, because you're right, we have to be interdependent upon each other, to be conscious of our interdependence, and also to be committed to it if we're going to do anything that will change the racial barriers and knock those barriers down. We've got to be committed to it in an aggressive manner.
Right, and so I guess we go back in the Christian churches to the model of Jesus, who reached out and overcame the barriers. There were no social barriers that he was afraid of. I mean, he was willing to knock them over, whether it was talking to women in public or relating to the hated Samaritans or reaching out to lepers who were outcast. He was a community builder. He was one who broke down the barriers and built up the bridges. And that seems to be part of what the Christian churches need to bring to that. Of course, then that has to get translated again into practical politics, which is really the focus. I mean, we got to overcome the racism that exists through political means. And I often think that, the civil rights legislation was terrific. I mean, you pointed out you have to change attitudes, yes, but by changing the legislation, by giving people the vote to the people in the South, for example, now we have, Andrew Young can be mayor of Atlanta.
That's right.
And Douglas Wilder can get elected. And we can, David Dinkins can get elected as New York's first mayor.
Yeah.
I noticed he got 27% of the white vote. Well, we open up the ballot to the blacks, and there's some racist attitudes overcome, and some whites become more open, and you can actually elect candidates. So I see an interplay there. And without the voting rights legislation, we couldn't have all of this.
We couldn't have done that. That's true. Yeah. And yet, by that legislation coming about, people are sort of made selfless to a certain degree. Christ became selfless in his approach to knocking down barriers. And well, even like Mandela in South Africa, the structure of living down there was more important to him. People having equal rights and fair treatment is more important to him than Mandela himself. And he took the risk of going to jail, not knowing that he would come out, alive. Steve Biko took the risk, but they killed him in jail.
Right. There was every chance that Nelson Mandela would be killed in jail.
That's right. But he took that risk and even willingly continued in that situation until he could feel that there was potential and possibility for change. I think we in the church do have to rise to that station.
The thing that's impressed me, Franklin, is his sort of what do I want to say? He wants to avoid violence, put it this way. I keep thinking they kept this man in jail all these years because of the violence question, or he was, dangerous person and all this. And yet when he comes out, he has a line that says negotiations, that says students go back to school, that says that we must keep confronting at all levels. But clearly, if he's talking about violence, it's only in response to the violence of the white minority that happens to have power. Yeah. He puts it in that context. It's not a matter of let's have a bloodbath or let's rise up now with weapons and go bomb these people. He wants to have negotiations and talk and move forward. I find him to be an extremely exciting leader, and there's a certain, I don't know if this is the right word, but moderation that I hear in his voice. He's a prophetic man, and he's courageous, and he people look up to him and so on. But he's talking diplomacy. He's talking ways of compromise and working out solutions.
And yet he has not failed to talk about challenging existing structures. And I think when people are willing to take risk, the strength that they develop also in a way somehow appears on their countenance. I remember when Mandela went to prison. I was a teenager. And I remember when he went to prison, he was a strong man. Well, you've seen some of the pictures of how he looked, almost 30 years ago. He was a strong-looking man. But coming out of prison now, even as he walks, he gives the appearance of full authority, full control. And it is a dynamic image to me to see all of these people in these soccer arenas and all of these people coming to him, and Dan Rather even at his opening the door for him and almost looking up to him. It's a dynamic image of the strength of one man who seems to have full control over all of these vast people who are around him, knowing that the possibility of change, the force of change, is right at his fingertips. And you're right, it's appealing. I think that's what Christ had. That's what we in the church have been given. Paul told us in the Corinthians letter that we have the ministry of reconciliation. It is a power that has been given to us to bring about change, to bring people together, to recognize the inequities and structures, and to not just to tear them down. It's easy to tear something down, but to cause them to be eradicated and to put in place something that is righteous and justice. I think that was Martin Luther's King's image.
Yes, right, and is being carried out by Nelson Mandela. To take the political element put that into place here again, I noticed that one of the lines of Nelson Mandela, when they ask him, what are you going to do? He says, I'm going to work within the structure of the ANC. Yeah. I'm going to stay within the party and to try to work along with other people in the party. And that represents to me, again, that idea of not just the charismatic leader, but of the coalition building, the collaboration you need in order to make progress. And I think that, again, to affect political matters, you have to have votes. It isn't just a matter of running around and having symbolic actions and feeling good about ourselves because we're anti-racist, and especially those of us in the white community and maybe the liberal white community. I mean, it's not enough to just to feel pure and say, I'm getting prejudice out of my heart and I'm with my black brothers and sisters here. It seems to me the real job is to form the political coalitions, to vote in people who are able to make a difference and to thereby get public policies in place that are going to help us overcome the great inequities in the employment situation, or greater opportunities for education, who are going to attend to all of those things. And that gets to be a messy business. I mean, you were in the middle of that, Franklin. I mean, you had to make hard choices, didn't you? I mean, there were prudential judgments that had to be made. And when you were dealing with some of the political matters in the city here, I mean, it gets messy. It's easy to be pure in the church, in a sense, isn't it? I mean, I can get up and give a homily against racism and walk home, and that's it. And it's sort of, you hope people run with the message. And I'm not putting that down because I think that's very important, and that we have to do that. But you were involved at another level of the thing.
But I think the strength of that structure is that it cannot just be a few black people or a whole community of black people. Neither, as you said, can it just be the liberals, but it must be the two. It must be all factions working together, joining hand in hand. I think the Black Panther movement of the late 60s was kind of a vivid example of that. If you really would read the Black Panthers manifesto, they talked about community building. Now, they gave the appearance of being a radical, group, and they carried weapons, which, were legal. They were legally allowed to do that. The imagery that they gave somehow didn't gel in the minds of people with the actual things that they were trying to bring about. And so, because of that, they weren't able to build the type of coalition. They did a lot of awareness building. Yeah. They made a lot of black people feel good.
But I think they turned off so many people you couldn't think of coalition.
Really get in. Right. Yeah. And that has to happen. There has to be, within structures, as you said, something that allows us to appreciate the disenfranchised. Maybe they can't talk as well as we talk. Maybe they cannot. They don't have the level of education that we have. Maybe they don't have the broad experiences of going from country to country as others may have. But there's some value in the thoughts and the attitudes of every individual. And if we could just learn how to hear them and make room for them within the structure of government, at every level.
Yes, I mean, our religious tradition teaches us that every person is called by name, by God. Every person has dignity and worth. Everybody was redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ and opened up to new life through his resurrection. So we have a basis, a strong religious conviction about what is important, that people ought to have a voice. They can't be powerless and left on the margins. They have to be brought into the political mainstream. I suppose that's why we try to register people and get minority people in the United States to go to the polls and to make a difference. I mean, that grassroots organization is good. Jesse Jackson's a good example. Someone said the real value of him running for president was that it got a lot of people registered at a local level and made a difference in a lot of local politics, and because people were involved in that way. Franklin, you got a short comment here before I try to summarize?
But only that is the mandate of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we become involved with each other, both on a personal level, but that we allow that to grow into community. For we are not Christians. We cannot be Christians outside of being part of community. Christ said that this is how we show the love that we have for him, by the love we share with each other. And that would be my closing comment.
Well, that's well said. That's well said. And then that translates into the political arena, that's so right. That then we are able to change our attitudes, overcome some of the racist outlooks, even the subtle ones, and then to form our coalition so that we're able to make a difference. We can begin to influence who gets elected, who holds office, and especially then to influence the public policy. So in that way, the Christian churches really can make an important difference.